Well, we can cross now to the European Parliament here in Brussels and speak to the former Prime Minister of Finland, Alexander Stubb, who has put himself forward as a candidate to be the next President of the Commission. Mr. Stubb, thank you very much indeed for joining us. What do you make of the seeming continued impasse in the Brexit negotiations between Britain and the EU 27?
Well, it's quite normal in these types of negotiations. We must remember that it's a historic negotiation. One of our most important countries is leaving the European Union, and it's never easy. And usually in these negotiations you have moments when you advance on a technical level, then comes a stop, then you advance on the political level, then comes a stop, and right now we seem to be at an impasse. At the end of the day we'll probably find some kind of a suboptimal solution. When that takes place, I don't know.
Do you think the European Union is being sufficiently constructive on this whole question of the Irish backstop? Because after all, a proposal which has the possibility of dividing the United Kingdom is simply something that no British Prime Minister could support.
I think it probably symbolically shows what Brexit is all about. It's trying to square a circle which is almost impossible to do. Basically, one side is saying that there should be no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. The other side is saying there should be no border between Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. And at the end of the day, you have
to but I mean, hang on, wait a minute.
Squaring the circle, whereby both sides are saying, and both, excuse me, I can't hear you very well. Both sides are basically trying to square a circle, and it's not working. For me, you know, Brexit is a little bit like the internet. You know, you can decide to leave it, but it doesn't really make sense.
Well, that's unfortunately something that the British people have voted for, and therefore the job of governments is to implement what their people have voted for. But you know, there is a difference after all. There is a border with the Irish Republic, which will be between two different sovereign nations, and apparently this proposal from the European Union that could mean a border within a country that won't even belong to the European Union. I mean, that's a bit rich, isn't it?
Well, I think, to be honest, Brexit is a little bit rich. It's a very difficult negotiation to deal with, and I think the issue of the Irish border, of the backstop, sort of symbolizes it all. It's really impossible to do in a sensible kind of a way, where you should have a world where you have free movement of goods and services and capital and people and the rest of it. But you know, the heads of state and government are trying to do their best to get the negotiation going and get it moving. And I also think that Theresa May is in a very difficult situation, because she has to on one hand negotiate here in Brussels, and on the other hand she has to go home with a negotiation result, and obviously she has a party which seems to be quite skeptical and tough. So I don't envy her task. She's had a really tough job.
But isn't that what we're really talking about? You have a vision of freedom of movement, of fluid borders, but we know that many people, British people, but also, you know, Jobbik in your own country, and for example in Hungary, a member of the European Union, that's simply not the worldview anymore, is it? There are many people who disagree.
Well, I think the best model of society is a combination of liberal democracy, social market economy, and fair globalization. We live in a world where goods flow freely, where services flow freely, and we have to make it justified. It's our model of society, and I think actually in the midst of the technological revolution, when we start having 3D printing, we start having drones moving goods around, I think it's quite silly to try to shut yourself off from the rest of the world. But we have to live with the situation with Brexit, and I think a lot of the politicians are trying to make the best out of a situation which everyone understands it's a total lose-lose proposition.
It sounds a little bit as if what they're actually trying to do is obstruct what people voted for in the referendum, and that surely is wrong.
No, not at all. No, not at all. I'm just trying to put a little bit of realism in the world that we live in nowadays. Look, here's an example. You are interviewing me from a studio in London on Sky News. I stand here.
No, I'm not. I'm in Brussels,
about
actually.
Free movement. You're in Brussels. So we're both here in Brussels. But in any case, I mean, the bottom line is that being against the European Union is a little bit like being against the internet. You can do it, but I've always said it would be much smarter to try to influence the content of it. Having said that, I'm a pragmatic Finn. Let's try to find a solution in this very difficult situation. And I would personally like to see a future relationship between the European Union and the United Kingdom, which is as close as possible.
And do you think extending the transition period by under a year, a matter of months, as Mrs May is saying, would be helpful?
Yeah, I'm sure it's helpful. I mean, the longer the transition period, I think the better. That also gives us more time to negotiate the future relationship between the UK and the EU. You know, when you're talking about the EU legislation, it is just so complex and so big, so the transition period will give you some leeway. You know, we have transition periods also when you join the European Union, so I think it should be able to work in both directions.
Where do you think this is going to go from here? Do you actually think there will be an agreement on leaving the European Union in an orderly fashion next March?
Yeah, usually the way in which the EU progresses is three phases. Phase number one is crisis, phase number two is chaos, and phase number three is suboptimal solution. So we will find a suboptimal solution to Brexit, which will then be sold by the British decision makers and European decision makers as a compromise and as a victory. But I do believe, unfortunately, that Brexit will take place. It's simply a reality that we have to go with.
OK, Alexander Stubb, thank you very much indeed for joining us from the European Parliament there.